The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. And welcome to our hearing this morning, afternoon I should say. Lawyer Xi Yang was tortured for the better part of 2 years because he dared to represent China's poor and persecuted. The account of his detention is both harrowing and horrible. Xi Yang was sleep-deprived and kept in isolation. Squads of police punched and kicked him for hours at a time. He was forced to sit for hours on a precarious stack of plastic chairs, his feet dangling painfully off the ground. Police made threats to his wife and children and said that they would turn him into an invalid unless he confessed to political crimes. Xi Yang and his fellow human rights lawyers wanted the best for China, but what they got was the very worst. Since July of 2015, almost 250 lawyers and legal assistants were detained, sending a chilling message to those fighting for legal reforms and for elemental human rights. We are here today to shine a bright light on the brutal, illegal, and dehumanizing use of torture and forced disappearance of human rights lawyers and rights advocates in China. We shine a light on dictatorships because nothing good happens in the dark. And as we will learn today, there are some very, very dark places in China. Chinese officials repeatedly tell us, and they tell me all the time, that I should focus more on the positive aspects of China and not dwell so much on the negative. That is a difficult task when you read Xi Yang's story or read Gao Zhejiang's account of his torture, and his wife and his daughter previously have testified before our subcommittee, or read the account of many other very, very brave women and men who are standing up for human rights in China. It's a difficult task when you look at Li Chunfu and his brother Li Heping. These are some of China's best and bravest and brightest, and now women and men with broken bodies, shattered minds, broken noses and faces, men and women who have aged 20 or more years after just 2 years or 3 of solitary confinement or torture. It is shocking, offensive, immoral, barbaric, and inhumane. It is also completely possible that Chinese officials believe the international community will not hold them to account. While President Xi Jinping feels feted at Davos and lauded in national capitals for his public commitments to openness, his government is torturing and abusing those seeking rights guaranteed by China's own constitution and, of course, its international obligations. One Oxford University scholar said that Xi Jinping has built the, quote, perfect dictatorship, an increasingly repressive garrison state that avoids any international censure. Through the United Nations and the sanctions available in the Global Magnitsky Act, however, we should be seeking to hold accountable any Chinese officials complicit in torture, human rights abuses, and illegal detentions. Xi Yang identified at least 10 police officers who tortured him. We have a list of those officers who he has named. They need to be investigated by the administration and sanctions meted out individually to these individuals who have visited such horror and cruelty upon him. We are in the process of gathering names of others as well. I, as chairman of this committee, will send those names to President Trump, Secretary of State Tillerson, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and the chairs and ranking members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, pursuant again to the Magnitsky Act protocol. We will seek UN investigations into the torture of China's human rights lawyers and human rights defenders. You know, as we all know, on several occasions, the Special Rapporteur for Torture has looked into the use of torture in China and has found it to be absolutely systematic. If you're arrested and you're a religious prisoner, or you're a political prisoner, a prisoner of conscience, you will be tortured. And you will be tortured with depravity and with utter cruelty. We know that this also violates China's obligations as a signatory to the UN Torture Convention. Where's the enforcement? We will also seek investigations under Global Magnitsky Act, as I said. I introduced the House version of that bill, which was signed into law last year. That law explicitly, and it says explicitly, that any foreign government officials who engages in or is complicit in torture can be sanctioned by denying entry visas into the United States or by imposing financial sanctions. Those who tortured Xi Yang and Li Heping should never benefit from access to the United States or to our financial system. We will hear testimony today from some of the wives who have suffered. You know, when a political or prisoner of conscience is sent off to jail and suffers, it's not just that dissident who suffers. It is the wives, the families, the extended families. Very often they're rounded up as well and interrogated and beaten. You know, we have the great Chen Quanzhen in our audience today and his wife Wei Jing. When Chen suffered the barbarity of the Chinese dictatorship for speaking up on behalf of women who have been coerced into forced abortions in Lingyi, he suffered in prison, then under house imprisonment, but his wife and his children also suffered and showed incredible bravery during that entire terrible ordeal. But he persevered, he persisted, and today is now free and speaks out very boldly and effectively on behalf of human rights abuses in China. Pastor Bob Fu, who will be doing much of the translation today, or some of the translation, he too was incarcerated as a prisoner of conscience. But again, he persisted along with his wife as well and found their way to freedom and now speaks out boldly as leader of China Aid. Finally, we'll hear from many fear that Mr. Li and Li Mingzi, his wife, will also be providing testimony to us today. After entering mainland China in March of this year for a personal trip, Mr. Li went missing for 10 days before the Chinese officials confirmed that he was being held on so-called national security grounds. Let me just say, we all know this. What a joke. People ask for human rights protections, and they're accused of national security violations. I mean, it just doesn't pass the straight face test, and it's about time that subterfuge and that lie, that big lie, is fully done away with and exposed. Many fear that Mr. Li is being detained under a harsh new Chinese law to monitor and control foreign-funded NGOs, enforced earlier this year as part of a crackdown on civil society. As some of you may know, I also chair the China Commission along with Marco Rubio, and every year we put out a very extensive account of the human rights abuse in China. One of the big changes, worsening changes, there are many, is the fact that the NGOs are now being, who had very limited freedom to begin with, have far less now, just as religious organizations and denominations are also being cracked down by this cruel dictatorship. Politically, let me just conclude by saying that we welcome the testimony of these wives. I hope and I pray, and we will monitor to ensure that because they have spoken out boldly and in an open forum like today, that any further retaliation against their husbands or any members of their families will be watched closely. And Xi Jinping will be noticed, and I do hope the Trump administration will be bold and effective, as well as Secretary Tillerson, in raising individual cases, because when you raise the individual cases, obviously it helps all the others as well. I yield to Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, for your remarks and for your leadership on human rights issues worldwide. Ranking Member Bass is unable to join us here today. I'm not the superstar that she is, but I'm glad that she's allowed me to be the ranking member this afternoon in her absence. Let there be no doubt that the United States will marshal its political and economic might for the cause of human rights around the world, and that we will ask the same of our allies. As we move further into the digital age, information is more accessible than ever, which means that the suffering and harm to people is also more visible than ever. The United States and nations around the world cannot turn away from what we see, and we must take action. The tenure of Chinese President Xi Jinping has been accompanied by an increasingly harsh crackdown on any individuals and groups deemed to be subverting state power. The passage of the law on the management of foreign NGO activities raises serious concerns. According to the 2016 State Department report on human rights, the Chinese law describes foreign NGOs as, quote, national security threats and requires all NGOs to undergo a difficult registration process. In doing so, the Chinese government has greatly restricted the political space of its civil society. Chinese environmental activists, ethnic minorities, religious leaders, and political dissidents, among others, are routinely arrested and given years-long prison sentences, often for actions as trivial as posting a comment online. And the lawyers representing these individuals often suffer equally severe treatment. Chinese human rights lawyers are routinely harassed by the Chinese security apparatus, detained for extended periods of time, tortured, charged with crimes, and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Last month, President Trump met with President Xi, where they discussed economic and political issues. The meeting came at a time when China's crackdown on human rights reached new heights. While President Trump raised the issue of human rights with President Xi, Secretary Tillerson dismissed the idea of discussing human rights in a separate dialogue. The Secretary instead stated that U.S. core values of human rights would be part of U.S. economic or political dialogue with China. Yet, Secretary Tillerson was the first Secretary of State who did not attend the annual release of the State Department's Human Rights Report since the mid-1990s. We here in Congress will pay close attention to the actions of the administration and ensure they follow through on U.S. commitments to advancing the cause of human rights in China and in nations around the world. Today, we will hear from 4 brave women who continue to show their courage by testifying in front of the United States Congress. Each of their husbands has endured unjust imprisonment and inhumane treatment under dubious circumstances. They deserve our appreciation for taking great risks by providing firsthand accounts of China's increasingly restrictive political environment. The perseverance of our witnesses and their families is a reminder that the fight for just and accountable government is a cause worth fighting for. It's also a reminder that progress towards a free and fair society is fragile and must be pursued every day. And of course, being a member of Congress from Texas, I want to acknowledge that one of our witnesses has been residing there. After narrowly escaping Chinese authorities in Thailand, Ms. Chen made her way to my home state. We're happy to have you here, Ms. Chen. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for sharing your stories and your family stories with us today. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castro. I'd like to introduce our distinguished witnesses and again thank you for your bravery and courage in coming forward. We'll begin first with Chen Gui-chu, who is the wife of Christian human rights attorney Xi Yang. Xi Yan focused his professional life on helping those victimized by the communist regime's forced demolitions and migrations, as well as impoverished people whose rights were trampled on by the Chinese government. Because of his work, he was taken away on July 11, 2015 as part of Xi Jinping's nationwide crackdown on human rights defenders. I mentioned some of the horrific ordeal that he has endured in my opening, and we will hear from his wife very shortly. We'll then hear from Wang Yafan, who is the wife of Tan Ji-ling, who is a human rights lawyer whose clients have included villagers fighting government corruption and victims of illegal land appropriation. In 2006, Tang's license to practice law in China was suspended, after which he became involved in a nonviolent civil disobedience movement in China. In 2012, he was detained for 5 days following his work investigating the death of a human rights defender. In 2014, Mr. Tang was detained on suspicion of inciting subversion of state power in the weeks leading up to the 25th anniversary of the Chinese government violent crackdown in Tiananmen Square. He was tried in July of 2015 along with 2 other prominent political advocates, and Ms. Wang is currently staying in the U.S. while she advocates for her husband's release. We'll then hear from Jin Bailing, wife of John T-Yong. John T-Yong is a veteran human rights lawyer who has worked on prominent cases, including those of Chen Guangzhen and Gao Zhejiang. He has also worked on cases advocating for the rights of AIDS and hepatitis B infected people, as well as other human rights and humanitarian cases. From 2009 to 2012, Chinese officials harassed, kidnapped, and physically tortured Tang, and on numerous occasions for his human rights work. In November, he traveled to Hunan to pay a visit to Chen Gui-chu the wife of the imprisoned human rights lawyer, who will speak momentarily. He was kidnapped while returning to Beijing on November 21st and placed under residential surveillance for alleged subversion of state power. He is now being held. Finally, we will hear from Li Jingyu, the wife of detained Taiwan community college worker Li Mingzi. Ms. Li graduated from the Department of Labor Relations at the Chinese Cultural University in Taiwan, where she and her husband met and began to participate in social movements. Before 2014, Mr. Li began discussing Taiwan's historical experiences and issues of transitional justice with a group of Chinese friends through the instant messaging app WeChat. In 2015, Mr. Li's WeChat account was blocked from using the group's chat feature, and Mr. Li began proactively seeking books as gifts to his Chinese contacts who were arrested in human rights or modern history. Around 2016, February, he was called on friends through WeChat to raise funds for the family of a Chinese civil rights activist. Later that year, in August 2016, books he sent to Chinese friends were confiscated. He went missing as he was entering the China from the city of Macau on March 19th, 2017, so that's just a few weeks ago. 10 days later, after his forced abduction, the Taiwan Affairs Office admitted he was in custody, and that he is, and that's why we are here today to seek his release as well. So we'll begin. We do have votes. How much time? Okay. I think because we do want to hear all of you, and Mr. Castor and I will take a brief respite to go vote, but we will then come back and we look forward to your testimony. And I apologize for that inconvenience. We stand on recess, subject to the call of the chair. The committee will resume its sitting, and I'd like to yield to Randy. Randy, any comments you might have?
I'll be very brief, but just wanted to say thank you for being here. Just am humbled and amazed by your courage, by the stands that you're taking, but also that your husbands are taking. And it is so important for us to hear your stories, to be able to share that with others, but also know this is, it's hard for us to still even comprehend or wrap our mind around what you're going through and what others like your families are going through. So our hope is meetings like this, hearings like this can encourage and push those entities that are doing these horrible atrocities to stop, to free your husbands, and to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else's husband. So thank you for being here. I look forward to hearing more of what we can do and hopefully seeing some positive results in very difficult circumstances. So thank you, Chairman. I
thank Chairman Hoektrum for coming, but also for his great work that he does as chairman of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. He does wonderful work there, including on human rights abuses in China. So thank you, Randy. I'd like to now ask Chen Hui-Chu if you could provide your testimony.
Honorable Chairman Chris Smith, Honorable Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organization representatives, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the wife of human rights lawyer Xie Yang. I would like to thank God, the Trump administration, China Aid Association, and the hardworking diplomats. I also want to express my gratitude toward Representative Chairman Smith, as well as other politicians and friends who are concerned with the development of human rights and the judicial system of China. With your help, my two daughters and I escaped from the jaws of death and arrived in the United States, the land of freedom. With your help, I'm able to stand here to speak on behalf of the victims in China who do not have a voice. I would like to give you a better idea of human rights conditions in China. And next, I will, with the help of Bob Fu, to help me. 我希望这个请求，国会将我对谢阳的酷刑的揭露以及谢阳的这个声明作为国会的永久记录，保存在国会。
So I have a request to the chairman that to submit the torture record of my husband and also my husband declaration on January 13th, 2017 about his torture as a part of the congressional record.
Without objection, all of those additions will be made a part of the record, and that goes for all of our wives. Whatever it is you'd like to become part of the record will be, without objection.
Thank you so much.
Xie Yang represented dozens of cases on behalf of the downtrodden, including poor Chinese citizens who have had their houses or land seized from them without compensation. Dissidents, members of China's religious communities, and other marginalized and persecuted groups. Due to his work defending human rights, he was jailed and brutally tortured. After Xie Yang was arrested by national security agents in Changsha and placed in secret detention for 6 months, his captors brutally tortured him in an attempt to make him confess and provide evidence against his colleagues. The methods of torture included beatings delivered in rotation by a roster of guards, exhausting interrogations for over 20 hours at once, having cigarette smoke blown into his face and eyes, starvation, dehydration, and the refusal of medical treatment for his illness. To force him to surrender, his interrogators even threatened to arrange a car accident to injure his wife and children. He was beaten by a prison guard named Yuan Jin during his detention. On November 21st, 2016, his defense lawyer, Zhang Chengshi visited Xie Yang for the first time and witnessed Yuan Jing beating him while he was waiting, Xie Yang's head swelled up and began to bleed. Inmates who have been released from his detention center told me that he was not allowed to access money, so he could not even buy toothpaste and toilet paper. Not allowed to communicate with others, he was purposely singled out. The guards specifically arranged for criminals sentenced to death to live with Xie Yang so that he would be beaten up and harassed. So the publications of Xie Yang's torture account has had an immediate impact both inside China and internationally, as I just submitted today. Xie Yang's court session was held on May the 8th, 2017. None of the witnesses showed up. None of the defense lawyers I hired showed up. I did not even receive a notice of the court session. Instead, Xie Yang attended the session with an official lawyer appointed by the government. The friends who planned to witness the court session were seized and arrested by the national security agents. Xie Yang was forced to admit his guilt and deny the torture he suffered in the detention center. Regarding the fact that he was not allowed to see his lawyer for 16 months or communicate with the outside world, he was forced to acknowledge that his rights were protected. He was bailed out after the court session, but still had not regained freedom. The national security agents followed him wherever he goes. I strongly hope the Honorable President Trump and the US Congress can immediately and effectively urge China's central government to investigate the actual facts behind the torture of those arrested in the 709 crackdown, simultaneously enacting legal sanctions against those who practice torture, and request that China clearly ensures that other incarcerated prisoners of conscience do not continue to receive harm. I call on President Trump to conscientiously implement the global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, punishing those who have irrefutable evidence of practicing torture and infringing on human rights. I earnestly request that President Trump meet with the family members of the Chinese people who have suffered before he goes to China. As he is visiting with them, publicly raise his concern for China's worsening religious freedom, rule of law, human rights conditions. I also ask that he publicly give China's leaders a list of prisoners of conscience to free the 709 cases victims, Chen Guiqiu. Thank you.
Ms. Chen, thank you so very much for your testimony, and again, for you and all of the wives for your bravery. We'd like to now ask Wan Yafan. So Ms. Wan.
尊敬的史密斯主席和各位外交委员会全球人权小组委员会议员们、先生、女士们，你们好！我是唐吉宁的妻子汪艳芳，在此感谢克里斯·史密斯、Hodgkin、马尔克·卢比奥、兰西·佩洛西等众多国会议员、对华援助协会傅西秋牧师、各位外交委员会全球人权小组委员会会员们对唐吉宁和中国人权、宗教迫害案件的关注、帮助和支持。
Honorable Chairman Smith, Honorable Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations representatives, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wang Yanfang, wife of human rights lawyer Tang Jingling. I'd like to express my gratitude to Representative Chris Smith, Senator Marco Rubio, Representative Nancy Pelosi, Representative Holmgren, and many other representatives, as well as Bob Fu, President of China Aid Association, for your attention and support of my husband and many other victims of human rights abuse in China.
希望国会记录和保存我丈夫唐金宁在狱中写的一个囚徒的人权报告。
I'd like to request the committee to archive my husband's report on the violation of human rights in Chinese prisons.
以下证词由施家代读。
The rest of my testimony will be read by Jasmine Shashi. As the institution of religious freedom, rule of law, and human rights continues to deteriorate in China, support for the victims from the international community is very valuable and precious. This is also an important milestone in joint endeavors to maintain universal values all over the world. In the past few decades, people of many countries terminated their seemingly powerful and long-lasting autocratic regimes through nonviolent resistance and fulfilled the transition from autocracy to democracy. My husband is a well-known human rights lawyer. He is also the initiator and a keen advocate of the civil disobedience movement. He is dedicated to promoting the civil disobedience movement, hoping to bring forth a democratic and free China. In 1995, the National Security Police began to monitor Tang Jingling after he expressed his lifelong mission to promote democracy in China. In 1999, he published an article on China's democratization in Guangzhou. Then he was forced to leave the big law firm he was working for. As a human rights lawyer, he's been involved in many major cases of human rights abuse, political rights abuse, and workers' rights abuse. For example, in 2003, a petition was initiated to abolish the internment and repatriation regulations and cancel the temporary residence permits policy after college student Sun Zhigang's death. Tang Jingling served as the legal counsel. In 2004, he was the defense lawyer for the two people charged in the Xinjiang labor unrest case in Dongguan. In January 2005, he defended the newly elected village head in the Shibi Third Villagers campaign to remove old village officials. In August 2005, he was one of the key lawyers in the case of the Taishi Villagers campaign to remove village officials. Due to his involvement in human rights cases, the authorities forced his law firm to terminate his employment and suspended his lawyer's license. In 2006, he planned to attend an event in the US, but he was stopped at the customs and his passport was confiscated by the police. He's still not allowed to leave the country to this day. After losing his lawyer license, he participated in many human rights cases as a citizen, including the poisonous vaccine lawsuit, the investigation of Li Wangyang's death, and many other cases involving land property, forced demolition, and so on. My husband graduated from Shanghai Jiao Tong University in 1993. He began to participate in law in 1998. He lost his lawyer license in 2005. Due to his work in human rights protection during the Jasmine movement in February 2011, he was charged with inciting subversion of state power and was detained in a black jail, where he was threatened and tortured, including extensive sleep deprivation for 10 days in a row. He was allowed to sleep for 1 to 2 hours a day after he began to have some dangerous symptoms, like trembling all over, numbness in both hands, and heart discomfort, until he was released on August 2nd, 2011. He initiated and promoted the civil disobedience movement to seek justice for people at the bottom of the society, but his wife was forced to lose her job in May 2008. During his detention in February 2011, I was forcibly brought to Konghua and detained. They took my phone, bruised my arms, and didn't allow me to notify my family and lawyer, which caused my severe depression and poor health. Then the police tricked my mother to go to Guangdong to take care of me, and I was put under house surveillance for a long time. I was not allowed to meet with any family and friends. I was not even allowed to leave my home. More than 20 people took turns watching me. I was completely isolated from the outside world for almost 5 months. When my husband was released, my physical and mental health had been severely damaged. On May 16, 2014, Tang Jingling was criminally detained on the charge of picketing quarrels and provoking troubles, and was arrested on June 20th with the charge of inciting subversion of state power. On September 23rd, his mother passed away on hearing of his arrest. His lawyer and I applied to bail him out to attend his mother's funeral, but the authorities ignored everything on legal, moral, and humanitarian levels and rejected our request. They didn't notify him of her death until October and caused deep sorrow. The authorities forbade his lawyer to meet with him for 6 months while his case was being transferred to the procuratorate. During the 2 years in the detention center, all communication was banned. There was no way to guarantee his rights. On January 29, 2016, he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with the charge of inciting subversion of state power. He's serving the sentence in Huiji Prison, Guangdong Province. Since he was arrested in August 2013, I was put under 24-hour surveillance, which brought huge emotional pressure and fear to me. However, I've been appealing for my husband and request the release of him. On July 1st, 2014, I went to Hong Kong to attend a demonstration and appealed in the media to urge people to pay attention to Tang Jingling and other prisoners of conscience, like Yuan Chaoyang and Wang Qingying. I was threatened by the police after returning to Guangdong, and my freedom was restricted during the so-called sensitive period. After the massive arrest of human rights lawyers on July 9th, 2015, I got in touch with families of arrested human rights lawyers and went to the Supreme People's Procuratorate with them. In August, I was not allowed to leave home. Since Tang Jingling worked as a lawyer more than a decade ago, he participated in many human rights cases and promoted civil disobedience movement. Consequently, he lost his lawyer license, he was detained, monitored, arrested, tortured, and sentenced, and his wife lost her job, was harassed, summoned, monitored, and detained. Today, other 709 case lawyers are still suffering from such torture. Many prisoners of conscience are still unable to meet with their lawyers and families. Christian churches are still being shut down. Christians are still being detained and sentenced. Thus, I sincerely plead with President Trump and the U.S. Congress to urge the Chinese government to guarantee Tang Jingling's right to meet with his lawyer and his right to reading, communication, medical treatment, and food with enough nutrition, as well as ensure that Tang Jingling, Wang Quanzhang, Zhang Tianyong, Wu Guan, Yuan Xingting, and other 709 case lawyers and prisoners of conscience have their basic human rights in prison and make certain that they are not being tortured and are released to reunite with their families. I hope President Trump can meet with family of the victims in the U.S. before his visit to China, talk about his attention to China's worsening religious freedom and human rights situation during his visit, and give the list of prisoners of conscience to the embassy. I believe this is also an important action to maintain universal values all over the world. Thank you, Wang Yanfang.
Thank you so very much for your very moving statement. And I'd like to now yield such time as you may consume to Ms. Jin.
尊敬的史密斯主席和各位外交委员会全球人权小组委员会议员们、先生们、女士们，大家好。
Honorable Chairman Chris Smith, Honorable Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations representatives, ladies and gentlemen.
非常感谢你们对我丈夫江天勇受人权迫害事件的关注。
Thank you very much for your attention to my husband Zhang Tianyong's suffering.
江天勇是一名人权律师，他从2006年就开始参与了人权活动，为乙肝携带者、艾滋病携带者，为无数个法轮功学员辩护，为维护律师权益而推动北京律师直选，并揭露了北京司法敲诈勒索犯罪行为等等。
Zhang Tianyong is a Chinese human rights lawyer. He began to advocate for human rights in 2006, representing hepatitis B patients, AIDS patients, and numerous Falun Gong practitioners. In order to promote the legal rights of lawyers, he contributed to the direct election of the Beijing Lawyers Association and exposed corruptions within the Beijing judicial system, such as blackmailing and racketeering.
我愿意有我和江天勇我们全家受到骚扰的这些照片，还有江天勇2011年茉莉花事件，他自己亲述的他被失踪2个月的这个讲述的这个录音，作为证据呈交给国会。
I am willing to provide the evidences, the photographic evidences of our heavy surveillance surrounding our house in China, and also the audio recording of my husband when he disappeared during the Jasmine Revolution.
下面我请我的翻译帮我读一下证词。
The rest of my testimony will be delivered by my translator. On October 29, 2009, Zhang Tianyong participated in a U.S. congressional hearing and spoke on the main theme, which was the problem with China's legal system and religion. As a result of his testimony, this time I am bearing witness to how the National Security Police retaliated against our entire family as a result of his testimony. Ever since, Tianyong was forced to stay home on sensitive dates, such as meetings of the National People's Congress, the Political Consultative Conference, June 4th, which is the anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, or during important political leaders' visits to China. He could only get out of the house by taking their police cars. I have videos to verify all of this. Beginning on February 15, 2011, Tianyong disappeared for 2 months during the Jasmine Revolution. He was brutally beaten, deprived of sleep, forced to watch CCTV news, sing songs, and recite patriotic articles to praise the Chinese Communist government, and write thousands of pages of repentance letters. The videos can serve as evidence. On May 3, 2012, 5 national security agents from Haidian District, Beijing, represented by Du Yuhui, beat Tianyong up when he attempted to visit the barefoot lawyer Chen Guangchen at the hospital. Tianyong temporarily lost his hearing due to the perforation of his left ear's tympanic membrane. The police repeatedly took Tianyong away for questioning and threatened him, saying that our child could not go to school if he refused to cooperate. They also said that I, as his wife, could be affected as well. The long-term harassment and threats consumed me. I even thought of suicide. My child's mental condition was severely disrupted. Desperate, I brought my daughter to the U.S. in May 2013. On March 20, 2014, the local national security agents arrested Tianyong again in Jinshanjiang, Heilongjiang, while he was representing Falun Gong practitioners. The police broke 8 of Tianyong's ribs during the 16 days of detention. I have the diagnosis from the hospital as proof. On November 21st, 2016, Zhang Tianyong disappeared on his way back to Beijing after visiting the family members of lawyer Xie Yang. Now, the government has already banned him from meeting with lawyers for 178 days, and we do not know where he is detained. Tianyong's parents have been put under surveillance. The national security agents follow them wherever they go. According to the news on May 12, 2017, Tianyong has been tortured, and his legs are too swollen to walk. In order to safeguard human rights and the universal worth of defending legal rights, I strongly hope the Honorable President Trump and the U.S. Congress can immediately and effectively urge China's central government to investigate the actual facts behind the torture of those arrested in the 709 crackdown, simultaneously enacting legal sanctions against those who practice torture, and request that China clearly ensures that other incarcerated prisoners of conscience do not continue to receive harm. In addition, I want to mention that Tianyong has already received a letter confirming his political asylum in the United States. I hope that President Trump can negotiate with the Chinese government during his visit and let Tianyong reunite with me and my daughter. May 19th is Tianyong's 46th birthday. I hereby make a wish on behalf of Tianyong and our family. I hope he can regain freedom so his aging parents would not have to worry constantly and his daughter could have her wish fulfilled and embrace her father. I hope I can forever set aside my heart, which anxiously worries about Tianyong, and a tranquil and merry life can come to our household. Thank you. Jing Bianling.
Jin, thank you so very much. I'd like to now yield to Ms. Lee.
尊敬的史密斯主席及诸位委员，午安。我是李明哲的太太李静瑜。我衷心的感谢各位今天站出来维护并捍卫民主与人权，如同所有的人权工作者，包含我先生，他们一生努力奋斗的目标就是这样普世价值。我也想借此机会向所有支持台湾关系法的国会议员表达我的谢意，特别是罗伊斯主席与史密斯主席。
Chairman Smith, members of the committee, good afternoon. I am Li Jingyu, wife of Li Mingzhe. I would like to thank each of you for upholding and defending the values of freedom and democracy, values that human rights activists, including my husband, have dedicated their entire lives and energies to. I would also like to express my gratitude towards all the congressmen, especially Chairman Royce and Chairman Smith, who strive to maintain and further secure the implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act.
以下的证词将由施家小姐代我宣读。
The rest of my testimony will be read directly by Jasmine Chashi. I'm deeply honored to be here today, alongside these three respectable women who have gone through such perilous situations for the cause of democracy and human rights. It's after hearing about their journeys that I realized how fortunate I am as a Taiwanese. I further understood the blessings of our democracy, which exists today thanks to the support of the US government and all the 20th century Taiwanese human rights activists, as mentioned by Chairman Royce in the March 14, 2014 hearing on the TRA. My husband, Li Mingzhe, is from a Chinese refugee family that immigrated to Taiwan following the nationalist government in 1949. His background and emotional connection to China have contributed to his support of Chinese human rights efforts. From 2012 until his disappearance, he gave online lectures through WeChat on the democratization of Taiwan and the history of the White Terror period. He also managed and contributed to a social justice fund for the purpose of financially supporting Chinese political prisoners and their families experiencing economic hardship that stemmed from their support of the values of freedom, justice, and democracy. On March 19, 2017, while on an annual visit to China to meet with people he worked on the fund with, my husband was subjugated to enforced incommunicado detention. It's been 61 days since I last saw him. I am concerned about his health, for he suffers from high blood pressure. I'm concerned for his safety. I do not know where he is, for the Guangdong government has refused to disclose the location of his detention. The deprivation of my husband's liberty by the local Guangdong government is arbitrary and transgresses the Articles 9, 19, and 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Cross-Strait Joint Crime-Fighting and Judicial Mutual Assistance Agreement, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It was not long after my husband's enforced disappearance that I learned about his detainment from a middleman. Since current cross-strait relations are highly abnormal, many such cases that involve Taiwanese people being detained or arrested in China are settled through brokers. These brokers, for the most part, represent the interests of the PRC. I was shown a copy of a letter that was written under involuntary circumstances by my husband. This letter was in the hands of Li Junming, a representative of the PRC Taiwan Affairs Office. He threatened me, insisting that I cancel my trip to Beijing and also silence myself. Li expressed clearly that the detention originated as a result of the provincial government of Guangdong's desire to show its strict enforcement of the newly passed foreign NGO management law. He threatened that if I were to go to Beijing, the local Guangdong government would release a video of my husband admitting to having committed criminal actions. The U.S. has long insisted that its policy of no negotiation with terrorists is to be firmly followed, I also believe in that policy. I refuse to negotiate with a broker on such unequal grounds. If I did, it would be harmful and shameful to my family, my country, and my fellow human rights activists. Additionally, to my great disappointment, the Chinese government has unreasonably revoked my travel visa, even though I have clearly and calmly explained that I only wanted to travel to better understand the situation. China's position towards human rights and the rule of law is drastically different from that of Taiwan and other civilized democratic countries. China should not assume that their military and economic growth could force Taiwan to be annexed by it. If China maintains that my husband's actions of spreading the values of democracy and aiding the family members of political prisoners can pose a threat to its national security, I believe the people of Taiwan will become not only more certain of their unwillingness to be annexed, but also hesitant to preserve a close relationship with China. It has only been around 20 years since Taiwan successfully overthrew the Right Terror's one-party dictatorship, so it is highly unlikely that we will be willing to accept another despotic government. I have no other choice but to come and stand before you, to ask for help from you. The United States of America is the leading democracy in the free world. It was built upon the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The U.S. has long been the protector of justice, freedom, and democracy everywhere. It has accepted the moral obligation to aid people deprived of their natural rights. The American Congress's unwavering dedication towards these values has influenced many countries, including my home country, Taiwan, to embrace the spirit of human rights and democracy. The U.S. Congress also voluntarily taken the responsibility, as specified in Section 2, Clause 3 of the Taiwan Relations Act, to preserve and enhance the human rights of the people of Taiwan. Therefore, I stand alone before you today to plead for your help for my husband. I'm pleading the United States to continue to act as according to the TRA. I'm pleading the United States to continue to support the value of which it has always unbendingly defended. I'm pleading the United States to continue to uphold the values of which it was formed upon. I'm pleading the U.S. government to pressure China to recognize the provincial government of Guangdong's illegitimate detention of my husband, Li Mingzhe, and free him. Thank you. Li Jingyu.
Ms. Lee, thank you very much as well for your testimony. Finally, the Taiwan government is working behind the scenes to resolve the case of Li Mingzhe, although I'm sure such efforts are hindered by Taiwan's complicated diplomatic ties with Beijing. As I've said before, Taiwan is an important democratic ally and a beacon of peace and democracy in Asia. The U.S. should remain committed to the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances as the cornerstone of U.S.-Taiwan relations. Political issues between China and Taiwan should be resolved through appropriate mechanisms between the two sides. The Chinese government's decision to detain Li Mingzhe signaled Chinese officials' willingness to break its international human rights obligations for political gains, again, needlessly straining the cross-strait ties. We do have a video, and I'd like to, about a 4-minute video. It was sent to us by the wives of lawyers of Li Huping and Wang Quan Zhang. It features Wang Xiaolin and Li Wenzhou, and it will now play for us.
尊敬的史密斯主席，各位外交委员会全球人权小组委员会议员们，先生们、女士们，你们好！ 感谢克里斯·史密斯等众多国会议员、对华援助协会傅西秋牧师、各位外交委员会全球人权小组委员会的议员们对李和平律师、对709案、对中国人权宗教迫害案件的关注支持，感谢你们。我是709家属王俏玲，我是李和平律师的妻子。
我是王全璋律师的妻子李文足。
我的丈夫李和平律师在2017年4月28日被中国政府秘密审判，被判颠覆国家罪名成立，判有期徒刑3年，缓刑4年。那在2017年5月9日，李和平律师回到家中，我跟我的女儿都没有认出他来。他整个的人苍老了将近20岁，面容苍老，身材消瘦，他的体重减少了30斤。那在这将近2年的这种与世隔绝的关押当中，他跟我们描述的用一个词形容叫做九死一生。在这个过程当中，他遭受了非常残酷的、变态扭曲的酷刑的折磨。当中让我们印象最深刻的是他描述的被强迫服药。他本身没有高血压病史，但是他在被关押之后就被医生诊断为高血压病，强迫服用一种高血压药物。在这个被强迫服药的过程当中，他质疑过这种药物，并且拒绝服药，但是却被那个护士还有这个看管的人员强迫按住他的四肢给他灌药。那他服下这种所谓治疗高血压的药之后，他发现自己身体各处肌肉疼痛，发现自己意识昏沉，而且在这个过程里面，他整个视力下降倒退的很厉害，他看不见东西。那这个服药的时间持续了有将近22个月，而且在这过程当中，这些药物的形状、药物的颜色都有所改变，数量也是有时候多，有时候少。那在这个他被关押的这近2年的时间里面，还有一个很严重的酷刑，就是戴一种叫做工字镣铐。那这种镣铐是在手铐和脚铐之间有一根铁链连接。当戴上这种镣铐之后，整个人就不能够直立，四肢不能够伸展。这种镣铐他被迫戴了将近1个月的时间，每天24个小时。这让他镣铐取下之后，他整个人都不能够直立起来，支起这个脊柱来行走。那在这将近2年的过程当中，他被殴打，他被这样一个放在一个空调的冷风口当中，被这个冷风持续不断的24小时这样用冷风来吹他，吹了好几天。这种状况，这种折磨的手段是非常常见，而且他会被要求保持一个姿势，一天十几个小时不能动，这都是他在这2年里面经历的。
709案到现在已经是676天了。王全璋是这当中唯一一个到现在音信全无的人，他没有在央视上出现过，没有被律师会见过，也没有与律师有过通信。只是有一位释放的律师曾说过，在秘密关押的期间，他们听到过王全璋惨烈的呼叫声。随着709案陆续释放的人，他们所揭露的这个遭受酷刑的这个情况，我为王全璋的生命安危万分担忧。我不知道他现在的身体状况是一个什么样子的，是不是因为酷刑身体残疾了，或者说这个人已经不在人世了，所以他们一直拒绝律师会见，害怕律师会见。709这些被释放的人，他们所披露的这些酷刑让我担惊受怕，种种不好的猜测让我寝食难安。所以在此，我盼望大家对王全璋的这个生命安危予以高度的关注，对709案还在关押当中的江天勇律师、吴冠先生持续的关注。谢谢大家。
尊敬的史密斯主席，各位外交委员会全球。
Thank you so very much for those insights, horrible and brutal as they are, concerning the torture. Let me ask a few questions, and then I'll yield to my colleagues for any questions they might have. And first of all, let me begin by saying to Ms. Jin how heartbroken I and others are over your husband's incarceration. I will remind members of our committee that your husband testified on November 10th, 2009 at a hearing that I chaired. He very much wanted to present testimony as a human rights lawyer. It was the Tom Lantos Commission, and I was chairing that hearing. And without objection, his testimony from that hearing will be made a part of this record as well. But he was very firm, very clear in his testimony. He talked about working with Chen Guangcheng on behalf of women who had been subjected to the brutality of the one-child per couple policy, a policy that treats women as chattel and forces them to kills their children, doesn't force them to kill it, kills their babies, and does so right up into the 9th month of pregnancy. As we all know, under that brutal policy, there are now missing about 62 million females, a direct result of sex-selected abortion, causing huge disparities in the male-female ratio. But as you know, Ms. Jin, your husband bravely tried to defend the women from this assault, and for that, he was incarcerated. I would add to that he returned to China, and this underscores something that has to come out of this hearing and all of our efforts going forward. He went back to China. President Obama was in Beijing. He asked and thought he had a meeting with him along with some of the other human rights lawyers. He did not. And hours after the President of the United States left on Air Force One, he was arrested, and his horrific ordeal that continues to this day continues. That is just, it shows, in my opinion, that there is a consequence for being so brave, which is why we are all concerned about you and your husbands, and the fact that at the highest levels of government, and this appeal is to the President of the United States today and the Vice President, Mike Pence, that our voice has to be clear. We have to look Xi Jinping and other top leaders in the eye, have names, lists, the way Reagan did and did so effectively during the worst days of the Soviet Union, when there was always a list of dissidents and human rights activists and Jewish refuseniks that he would tender to the leaders of the Soviet Union. And those people, not all, but many of them got out. And for many others, the torture was ameliorated because we paid attention to what was going on. I would also add that we will ask President Trump, we will present him with your testimonies and Vice President Pence and ask him to meet with you. And I would add, we would ask him to meet with the 5 daughters as well and a few other very notable human rights activists who have suffered for their convictions in China. We had 5 daughters here presenting testimony in 2013. We called it the 5 Daughters Hearing. They all had a dad who was incarcerated and subjected to torture. We asked President Obama to meet with them so that when he met with Hu Jintao and after that Xi Jinping, he would have their cases and their pleas, their appeals, often through tears, uppermost in his mind to convey that agony to the leader of the Chinese government. We tried for months to arrange that meeting. At the end of about 6 months, we were told by the White House, he doesn't have the time. Now, if President Trump and Vice President Pence gives the same indifference, same answer, which I think is a callous disregard for suffering people, I will be here at this podium speaking out against that lack of concern and empathy for suffering people. Those young ladies said at that hearing, President Obama has 2 daughters. He'll understand what it's like for a daughter to speak on behalf of her father. You as wives are doing exactly the same. And I want you to know we, in this committee, both sides of the aisle, have nothing but concern and empathy for each and every one of you, for your husbands, for your families. And just a couple of very quick questions. When your husbands are incarcerated, and many of you spoke about this, Ms. Wang, you spoke of being severely damaged physically and mentally, your health-wise, because of your husband's incarceration. The Chinese dictatorship knows that when they arrest your husbands or any dissident or prisoner of conscience, the whole family goes to jail. They know that the friends of the family of the incarcerated individual goes to jail as well. All the more reason why we need to significantly up our voices, make our voices much clearer in Congress and at the White House, at the State Department, and added to that, we need to use the tools that are at our disposal, from country of particular concern for religious believers, sanctioning the government of China for its egregious human rights violations on religious freedom, use the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and make them a Tier 3 country, which they deserve to be, for their complicity, the government's complicity in human trafficking, which is bad and getting worse, and then for the political dissidents like your husbands, who represent a cross-section of suffering individuals in China, including labor rights. There's no doubt that China does not respect ILO standards, International Labor Organization standards, from collective bargaining to even paying a decent wage. And with impunity, they crush independent trade union efforts we've had at our hearings in the past. Leaders of that movement come and testify and say, yeah, they have a labor union run by the government. It is a farce. So my question would be the impact on the families, and also, if you would, speak to your hopes and expectations of what we might do next. Again, I think you've said it in your testimonies. Implement our laws. We have a toolbox filled with a capacity to hold China to account. Magnitsky is just the latest iteration of a tool that can't stay in that toolbox. And the Chinese government must know, collectively as a government and individually, those who commit these crimes need to be held to account, and we have the tools to do it. So, yes. Ms. Wang. Chen, I should say.
非常感谢。我觉得今天有个最新的消息，就是他们国宝们押着谢阳回到我家里面，然后呢，他们告诉我的亲人需要我回国。如果我不回国的话，谢阳就没有自由。
I have a latest news today. This public security officers threatened my husband and the family members that if I do not return to China, they will give him a heavier sentence.
所以呢，我觉得我在美国也是不安全的。我就首先请求美国来保护我和我的2个女儿的安全。
So I feel, even in the United States, I don't feel safe, and if I'm haunted, and I really seek protection by the U.S.
Would anybody else like to comment before I yield to Mr. Castro? Yes.
当然，我还希望这个美国政府这边能够跟中国政府，希望他们无罪释放谢阳，同时无罪释放709所有被捕的这些律师和公民，让他们恢复这个正常的生活，以及停止他们对他们的这个妻子、儿女，他们的亲人的这种压迫。
So I call upon the U.S. government to express to the Chinese government to stop this kind of brutal persecution against the victims of the 709 cases and their family members, and to restore their dignity.
因为他们会有各种办法来否认当事人，就是被关押的人，他们的酷刑，所以我提醒美国政府，希望他们公布他们的这种被关押期间的录像，因为他们是因为中国是加入这个联合国酷刑委员会的成员。
Because the Chinese government is also a signatory country of the anti-torture international covenant. So I want to call upon the Chinese government to reveal and release the videos that during these victims' incarceration, and to show what they have gone through.
因为我们709的这个小孩这个都不能上学，所以我希望这个川普总统也是有小孩的。我希望川普总统能够见见我们，同时他在中国之后能够见见这个709的家属以及这个被释放的这些律师们，听听他们在监狱里面受到什么样的遭遇，他们的妻子儿女们在中国受到什么样的遭遇。
And because all the family members of the 709 cases and other persecuted, their children are stopped by the Chinese government for education and schooling, and President Trump has his own children, so I do hope he can meet with us. We can express that to him face to face. Oh, and also, yeah, our family members inside China. Yeah.
Ms. Jin.
江天勇因为现在被失踪了，被指定监视居住，马上到6月1号就半年了，6个月了。
By June 1st, it's already 6 months of my husband Jiang Tianyong's enforced disappearance.
现在他的父母被跟踪监视。
And right now, both of his parents are being monitored and followed closely.
并让他们写保证书，不让他们和我联系，不让谈江天勇的事情。
They were forced to write the promises that they would not communicate or having any contact with me.
现在江天勇在里面遭受了酷刑。刚才听到709被捕律师被释放出来的李和平律师的太太，披露了李和平在里面呢所遭受到酷刑。
After, of course, we just heard from Ms. Wang Qiaoling, the wife of Li Heping, who revealed the torture he had experienced. And Jiang Tianyong also had been experiencing torture.
李和平还有李春富、李竹云等等被释放出来的709被捕律师都有同样的经历，就是被灌药。
And the similar experience of being drugged was also shared by other recently released human rights lawyers like Li Chunfu, like Li Shuyun, and of course Li Heping.
并且李春富被迫害成精神分裂。
And to the point, Attorney Li Chunfu was even tortured with serious mental illness.
就在昨天晚上，官方的微博放了一小段视频。
Even last night, the Chinese official microblog, the Weibo, showed a short video clip.
那个视频上就是播放了江天勇在散步。
On that video, it shows my husband Jiang Tianyong was kind of walking.
说他没有遭受酷刑。
And on that video, it claims Jiang Tianyong was not tortured.
但是我看到那个短短的视频里，江天勇的双下腿就是被那个紫色的黑印还在。
But when I observed that short video, I noticed on the legs, both legs of Jiang Tianyong, the kind of black and blue the mark are still there on his legs.
他的脸是浮肿的。
And his face has been very swollen.
他的右胳膊是走路不能甩动的。
And his right arm cannot move when he walked.
所以他们说江天勇没有受到酷刑，我不相信。
So I could not believe that what the government claimed that he was not tortured.
所以我非常担心江天勇的这个生命的安危。
So I'm deeply concerned about what's happening with Jiang Tianyong and his well-being and his life.
至今江天勇也不让律师会见。
And even until today, he was denied of lawyers' visitation.
所以江天勇在2016年已经获得了那个美国的这个政治庇护的这个批准信。
And further, Jiang Tianyong has already been approved as a U.S. asylee granted by the U.S. government in 2016 already.
但是中国边境不让他出境。
But the Chinese regime refused to let him exit from China.
所以我希望美国政府和中国政府我希望川普和中国的领导人去交涉。
I hope President Trump can really express this point with the Chinese leaders.
请中国政府放行江天勇，让江天勇来美国和我们母女团聚。
And plead with the Chinese government to release Jiang Tianyong and to have family reunion here in the United States with us.
因为我的女儿今天是江天勇的生日。
And today is Jiang Tianyong's birthday.
我的女儿，我们来美国4年了。
My daughter and I had been here for 4 years.
但是我们一次面也没有见到。
But we have never met again.
我的女儿很想抱抱她的爸爸。
My daughter is really, really eager to hug her daddy.
Thank you. Mr. Castro.
I know, I think they just called votes, and so I want to say thank you to each of you for your courage and your bravery in coming here to Congress and telling us your stories. I hope that you'll continue to give us counsel and guidance on how you believe the United States can be more helpful as it comes to China and the issue of human rights. And we, in turn, will monitor not only your situations and the situations of your husbands, but also of others who are going through similar things in China. And as I mentioned earlier, this should be an effort not only for the United States, but also for the allies of the United States around the world. So your suggestions on how you believe that the friends of the United States, those nations who also believe in strong human rights, can be helpful with respect to China and ensuring that China is a place that respects the human rights of its people and the freedoms of its people. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Castro, thank you very much. Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's troubling as I review the remarks of the ladies here today and consider that not only were the victims of the 709 crackdown jailed and subsequently tortured because they were brave enough to take a stand in favor of human rights, but that in fact it would appear that a meeting planned with the United States President may have been a pretext for an arrest of other individuals in China. As a member of this committee, I understand that when we hold hearings such as this, it's our responsibility to try to work to help people. But it is my fear that your courage in being here might be used as a pretext again to hurt people. With that said, I understand that as one member of 435 and one of 2 chambers of a legislative body, there is only so much that I can do, but I want to be abundantly clear for the record and for these brave women. To the extent that I have the ability to cast a vote that will deal favorably or unfavorably with the regime based on how it treats its own citizens and people who seek to effect positive human rights changes, I will consider their actions when I make my vote. To the extent that I have the ability to put forward policy that will shape the United States policy as it relates to nations based on how they treat their citizens and other citizens, I will consider these things in how I advance policy. And to the extent I am able to influence my colleagues and the executive branch of this government as it relates to relations with foreign nations, to include dominant global forces such as the People's Republic of China, I will consider how they treat their people and other people as it relates to human rights when I seek to exert that influence. We shouldn't convene committee hearings to help people that we know have the potential to lead to greater harm to people without ensuring the folks that we seek to help, you all, that we'll do everything in our power to make sure that all we can affect that is good is affected. With that, I offer my admiration and my thanks for the courage of these ladies, my encouragement for people who, in China as everywhere, seek basic human rights as outlined in foundational American documents, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but as aspired to by people across the globe, and promise that within my small ability to make a difference, I will side with human rights and with people who have suffered like yourselves wherever possible. And I appreciate the chairman for creating this opportunity, and I commend your courage, and to the extent it's appropriate, you have my prayers and my promise to do what I can.
Mr. Garrett, thank you very much for that very strong statement, and you're right. They all have our prayers, as well as everything we can do as a committee in a bipartisan way and as a Congress to assist your husbands and the other lawyers. I remember years ago on a Northern Irish hearing, we had a woman whose husband was murdered, a human rights lawyer named Patrick Finucane, and the bottom line was that by killing and hurting lawyers, who are really one of the last protections that citizens have to exercise due process rights and to get their case and to resolve grievances, the Chinese government is going for the jugular with this, and I think all of us in the Western countries need to realize that our voices have to be raised higher and louder and more effectively than ever before. And as I said before, every tool that we have in our toolbox needs to be deployed on behalf of your husbands. If the lawyers are silenced, where does any aggrieved party go for help? Even in a flawed rule of law country like China, there was still, as your husbands did, you effectuated change. They spoke on behalf of victims and in some cases got durable remedies. So I want to pledge to you that we will all continue. We will make that request of the Trump administration, that you meet with him and with the Vice President, and we will do that immediately by way of letter and by way of phone calls and visits, because he needs to look you in the eyes so that when he looks Xi Jinping in the eyes, he has your husband and your interests right there, front and center. So if there's anything you would like to add in terms of that we might have missed, this is your opportunity before we run over to vote. Is the vote on now? Oh, okay. If you could, thank you. We're joined by Chairman Mark Meadows, but if there's anything that you would like to add before we conclude. Yes, Ms. Wang.
你好，我想补充一下，关于希望美国政府希望做些什么。
I would like to add on to what we hope the U.S. government will be doing.
我的先生唐金林是倡导甘地非暴力活动，并没有违法。
My husband, Mr. Tang Jingling, was not participating in anything illegal.
这是世界和中国所认可的。
These are recognized by both the international community as well as China.
虽然他现在判刑5年，但是我希望他无罪释放。
Although he is sentenced to 5 years, I hope that he could be released.
因为在2014年9月份的时候，唐金林因为他倡导这种非暴力不合作运动被关押，而导致他的母亲因而离世。
Mr. Tang was incarcerated due to his participation in nonviolent civil disobedience, and that resulted in his mother's death.
我希望他能够回家看望自己年迈的父亲。
I hope he could come home and visit his elderly father.
第二是，我是希望美国将受迫害的良心犯的家属被株连、被迫害作为一个重要的关注对象项目，提出来。
I hope the U.S. would put extra emphasis and more just follow these situations of human rights victims or political prisoners and their families who are being persecuted.
对中国政府提出严厉的批评，因为这个是违反人权、亲情和 人伦的。
Because these actions are a violation of human rights, we hope that the U.S. government will bring these concerns to the Chinese government.
应该停止所有在押犯人的酷刑。
The torturing of all the incarcerated people should stop.
停止所有家属的迫害及代理律师、小孩子的迫害。
They should also stop the persecution against their families, lawyers, and their children.
也停止对宗教、基督徒、佛教和法轮功人士的迫害。
They should also stop their persecution against Christians, Buddhists, Falun Gong, or other religious groups.
第三，我是希望驻北京的驻华大使能够会见被迫害的这些家属们。
Thirdly, I'd like to request that the ambassador to China in Beijing would meet with these victims and families of these victims.
也希望川普总统能够再去美国会见中国的国家主席的时候，能够会见在美的这些家属。
I would also like to ask that before President Trump meets President Xi, he would also meet with the families of these victims who reside in the U.S.
谢谢。
Thank you very much.
感谢主席。我认为李明哲事件已经造成台湾 NGO 工作者的寒蝉效应。
My husband's incident has caused a panic among Taiwanese NGO workers.
我希望美国可以严重的关切李明哲事件。
I hope the United States could strongly pay attention to my husband's incident.
因为这极可能是未来全世界的 NGO 工作者在进入中国之后都有可能去面临到的一个危险。
Because all NGO workers around the globe might face the same situation.
Thank you. Without objection, a letter signed by several scores, I think there's about 40 scholars on behalf of your husband will be made a part of the record. It includes a very diverse group of people, including the former chief of staff for one of our colleagues, Senator Claiborne Pell. And without objection, this will be made a part of the record. Yes. Anybody else before we close? And Mark, would you want to? Ms. Chin.
我还有一个就是小小的要求，就是我希望美国政府和中国政府交涉，就是要调查这个709事件被灌药的这个事情。
I have another small request. I hope the U.S. government can raise this issue to ask the Chinese government to launch an independent investigation on the torture against the lawyers in the 709 cases, and especially the torture method of being drugged. Yeah.
谢谢。
Thank you.
I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Meadows.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you once again for being a voice for so many people who don't have a voice. I mean, there is one person out of 435 members that is a champion, and that's not to be disrespectful of my colleague. I think he would recognize that there is a champion who always wants to make sure that he reaches out, and you recognize that, but both Democrats and Republicans, and I just want to say thank you. But for each one of you, I want to also say that with my colleague opposite from a Democrat perspective, but also on the Republican side, that we will work in a bipartisan way to address these atrocities and these human rights violations. And I can assure you, at the very highest levels of our government, they will be made aware of the personal tragedy that you've had to endure, and so I just wanted to say that for the record, that your testimony here today is meaningful, and it will be shared in the appropriate way. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Meadows, thank you very much, and I really appreciate your work on behalf of human rights. That's been longstanding, and particularly as a member of this committee. Thank you. The hearing is adjourned, and I thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.